Good morning. My name is John Jentz. I'm on the adult ed team here at First United Church in Oak Park. This week we're welcoming back Laurel Koepf, Associate Professor at McCormick Theological Seminary here in Chicago. Laurel is going to talk about family and children in the world of the ancient Near East. She is also the author of Give Me Children or I Shall Die, Children and Communal Survival in Biblical Literature. Welcome back, Laurel.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Great. Yes. So I'm very pleased to be back here after last week, and I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what we discussed last week, now with some images. Obviously, this is a recreation. So last week, we talked about families. What families looked like, how families functioned in the world that gave us the Bible. And the word for family in Hebrew is be'av. It would be, so I have sort of a pronunciation guide for you there. And I drew little squares, but this is what these little squares would have actually represented, is the idea that a family would have been an extended family living in several small pillared houses, a courtyard, and the farmland around that. And that the people in the family, the animals that were a part of that farming community, the land around it, the buildings, all of that is part of the Beit Av. So although it translates family, it's very much like extended family, and it's also very much like household. Another picture. Let's see. So how do we know that it looks like this? Well, this is what it looks like when we find it today. We call it a pillared house because some of what we find in the archaeological remains of a house from the Iron Age period is these pillars that would have held up the second floor. And so it's a small space. It's built of stone, it's built of mud, and if you want to see what it would have, another recreation of what it would have looked like on the inside, that's how where those pillars would be. Now, the ground floor was primarily used for storage and animals. So animals are housed in the same building as the family. We know that animals would have been stabled indoors on that ground floor, partially because they can't use ladders, but also because we find in those archaeological remains a phytolith surface, which means that there is organic, fossilized organic material from when the animals were there. And so you would have animals stabled and you'd have storage. What we find from storage are often large clay jars, for example, that would have contained things grain, wine, that sort of thing. And then the upper floor and sometimes roof can convert between a workspace and a sleeping space. Sleeping mats can be rolled up to turn it into a workspace, etc. So this is the sort of household that folks would have lived in, with 2 or 3 of these small pillared houses, a central courtyard, the land around that, and the extended family lives there. Now, you may remember that if you were here last week that we talked about how extended family would have been defined. That it's defined patrilocally, which is to say sons are forever and daughters are temporary. That daughters marry into a Beit Av when they come of age, and sons stay in the Beit Av that they were born into. We talked also about how this was determined based on the gendered division of labor. That the gendered division of labor in this economy was that men brought in the raw products of agriculture and women turn it into something that can be used. So that would be taking things like grain and meat and skins and clay and turning them into things like food and clothing and containers, right? And so the geographically transferable skill set is that skill set of taking those products and turning them into something. And so the family functioned on this primarily economic basis. Today, we're going to take this idea about division of labor another step further by talking about how children figure into this family structure. But before we do that, I want to start by thinking about children today. So I want you to think about a child or children that you know, that you have recently encountered or spent some time with. How would you describe a child or children today?
Difficult.
Difficult, yeah.
Privileged.
Impatient.
Oh.
Very involved with sports, music, other activities for them that
Yeah.
help themselves.
To follow their interests. Some,
Scheduled.
Peer influenced.
They're more isolated, they're self-reliant.
and so, well, there's some responsibility, you know, some tasks, some chores.
They seem to live more in silos than I did when I was growing up.
They're more inside. They're not playing outside in the front, you know. Our blocks don't have kids playing outside.
They often have their own space.
Most don't have a huge extended family.
Small, yeah.
Child care issues.
Many caretakers. Yeah, each of them has many caretakers.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah. Okay.
School.
And what are some ways that children in general, right, so we've thought about children specifically, get described? How do kids in general get described in our culture?
Technologically savvy.
Mm.
Cute.
Intellectually bright.
Sweet.
All right. Let's take that as our starting point. Now, I'm going to read to you from the beginning of an article that came out in the New Yorker back in 2012. When this article first came out, my first child was 2 months old. Now he's 13 and he's in the other room. And I just want to say that having read this article did not change anything for me. In 2004, Carolina Izquierdo, an anthropologist at the University of California, Los Angeles, spent several months with the Matsugenka, a tribe of about 12,000 people who live in the Peruvian Amazon. The Matsugenka hunt for monkeys and parrots, grow yucca and bananas, build houses that they roof with leaves of a particular kind of palm tree known as a kapashi. At one point, Izquierdo decided to accompany a local family on a leaf-gathering expedition down the Urubamba River. A member of another family, Yanira, asked if she could come along. Izquierdo and the others spent 5 days on the river. Although Yanira had no clear role in the group, she quickly found ways to make herself useful. Twice a day, she swept the sand off the sleeping mats, and she helped stack the kapashi leaves for transport back to the village. In the evening, she fished for crustaceans, which she cleaned, boiled, and served to the others. Calm and self-possessed, Yanira asked for nothing. Izquierdo later recalled, the girl's behavior made a strong impression on the anthropologist, because at the time of the trip, Yanira was 6 years old.
Whoa.
While Izquierdo was doing field work among the Matsagenka, she was also involved in an anthropological study closer to home. A colleague of hers, Eleanor Ox, had recruited 32 middle-class families for a study of life in 21st century Los Angeles. Ox had arranged to have the families filmed as they ate, fought, made up, and did the dishes. Izquierdo and Ox shared an interest in many ethnographic issues, including childbearing. How did parents in different cultures train young people to assume adult responsibilities? In the case of the Angelinos, they mostly didn't. In the LA families observed, no child routinely performed household chores without being instructed to. Often, the kids had to be begged to attempt the simplest tasks. Often, they still refused. In one fairly typical encounter, a father asked his 8-year-old son 5 times to please go take a bath or a shower. After the 5th plea went unheeded, the father picked the boy up and carried him into the bathroom. A few minutes later, the kid, still unwashed, wandered into another room to play a video game. In another representative encounter, an 8-year-old girl sat down at the dinner table. Finding no silverware had been laid out for her, she demanded, "How am I supposed to eat?" Although the girl clearly knew where the silverware was kept, her father got up to get it for her. In a third episode captured on tape, a boy named Ben was supposed to leave the house with his parents. He couldn't get his feet into his sneakers because the laces were tied. He handed one of the shoes to his father. "Untie it." His father suggested that he ask nicely. "Can you untie it?" Ben replied. After more back and forth, his father untied Ben's sneakers. Ben put them on, then asked his father to retie them. "You tie your shoes and let's go," his father finally exploded. Ben was unfazed. "Just asking," he said. A few years ago, Izquierdo and Ox wrote an article for Ethos, the Journal of the Society of Psychological Anthropology, in which they described Yanira's conduct during the trip down the river and Ben's exchange with his dad. The juxtaposition of these developmental stories begs for an account of responsibility in childhood, they wrote. Why do Matsagenka children help their families at home more than LA children? And why do LA adult family members help their children at home more than do Matsagenka? Though not phrased in exactly such terms, questions like these are being asked, silently, imploringly, despairingly, every single day, by parents from Anchorage to Miami. Why? And so that's the question that we ask as we look also at a comparison between our practices with children and those we see in the world that produced the Bible. And how then that can help us read the Bible through its own cultural context without assuming our own. Things like family and childhood are things that we experience viscerally and daily. And so it's very easy to assume that our experience of family and childhood is universal. And yet when you read a story like this, you can tell that some of the things that seem completely unavoidable to us are not universal and work completely differently in other contexts, particularly other economic contexts. Right? I told you before I read this story that I knew all of this before my children were born. They still fit that way more than they fit this. right? Knowing this information didn't change it. So how do children learn how to be children? Right? Children learn what it means to be a child from the cultural context that they live in, from the way everyone around them treats them, and that includes family, certainly, but it includes peers, it includes strangers, it includes media. Perry Nodelman has talked about the hidden adult in children's literature. Children's literature is an unusual category because it's one of the only categories of literature that is made by one population for another. And so, although older children's literature, back from the turn of the century, from the last century, was intentionally trying to be pedagogical, right? Had stories about how you should behave with a clear moral. And when we moved at the turn of the century with Alice in Wonderland and Wizard of Oz, right, to the literature of delight and entertainment, there's still an implicit curriculum teaching what childhood is for. Only it went from the curriculum before that was intentional, teaching children that you need to behave and be useful, to you are here to be delighted. Do any of you remember the Beverly Cleary book, Henry Huggins, from the 1950s? You don't have to, but. So, for example, this is a little boy who is sitting around wishing that something exciting would happen in his life. And then what happens is he finds a dog, tries to take a dog on a bus, gets in trouble for taking the dog on the bus, ends up getting to keep the dog and getting to ride in a police car because he got in trouble for taking the dog on the bus. And so he gets what he wanted. He gets an adventure. But we're meant to laugh along the way at how childish he is for thinking he could take a dog on the bus, for thinking that riding in a police car is an adventure, for wishing for an adventure when we know that adventures are a little bit complicated. But remember, it's not just us, the adults, who are laughing along the way. Children are meant to laugh at this book. Children have to know what it's implied that Henry doesn't know, or the book wouldn't be funny. It would be terrifying. There's always a hidden adult in children's media. We have made major economic shifts, certainly since the world of the Bible. But even at that same time as that shift in children's literature, there was a major shift in how we thought about childhood relating to the Industrial Revolution. Because there had been a need for a large, unskilled labor force. And once the economy shifted to a need for a smaller but literate labor force, the rhetoric around childhood also changed. Right? This is when we started having child labor laws, for example. Now, there had been advocates for child labor laws prior to this, but they'd been unsuccessful because children were considered so necessary in the workforce. And there were specific exceptions made. Now, the exceptions that were made were given emotional rationales, but they also make sense economically. Right? So some of the exceptions to child labor laws are actors. Because it's just play, right? Well, not if you've met any adults who survived being a child actor, right? outside, it's good for you. Anybody grow up on a farm? Right? Is farm labor real labor? Absolutely. Absolutely. Newsboys builds character. Now, the farm lobby, the newspaper lobby, and Hollywood were incredibly popular and incredibly powerful at that time, right? And they still needed child labor where other industries didn't. You can also see this in wrongful death of children claims at that time. So prior to this shift in how we think about childhood, the way that a wrongful death claim for a child was calculated was based on that child's income. How much the child was likely to would have made for the family in the time between the time of death and the age of 18. And if a middle-class family with a child who did not work attempted a wrongful death claim, they got nothing. They were unsuccessful. However, after this shift, this is when we started seeing astronomical amounts for the death of a priceless child, as opposed to the death of a valuable child with an income. Finally, another place we see this shift is in adoption. So previously, the children who could find an adoptive home most easily were older boys, because they could do farm labor immediately. And so the next most popular was older girls who could provide childcare immediately. If anyone else is thinking about Anne of Green Gables, I am too, right? So that was the practice, whereas infants had a very, very difficult time finding an adoptive home. They were placed in places called baby farms, where one person would be paid to try to keep them alive with limited success. Now, it's completely the opposite. There are waiting lists for newborns, especially girls, because they're considered to be better at loving. And the purpose of a child is someone to love and who will love you in this context, whereas older boys languish in foster care indefinitely. Right? So we have experienced this economic shift in the last 100 years that completely reshaped the way we think about childhood. And it's not just one shift, but it's a continual shift toward the overscheduled child. Right? So we are constantly having changes in how we, as adults, imagine childhood. And our imagination is part of the implicit curriculum children receive about what they're supposed to be and how you are rewarded, as Henry Huggins was, for being the kind of child you are expected to be. Questions? It is. It is. So let's take that and connect it to the Bible. In the biblical world, right, in this kind of household, we talked about how there is a gender division of labor. And that gender division of labor, we said that men bring in the raw products of agriculture, and women take those products and turn them into something usable. Right? They take grain, they grind it with a rock into flour. They mix that with household mold, because yeast doesn't just come in little packets at the grocery store, sadly. And they bake that in a communal oven. One of the things that archaeologists have discovered is that the grinding stones that are used to create flour, there isn't one in each house. There isn't even one or two in each Be'av, extended family household. the broader community, so the cluster of Beit Avs that identify themselves as a tribe, they keep all of the grinding stones in one house. Not because they're going to carry them, because they're heavy, right? And everyone uses one communal oven, which means that the work of making bread is very much like a quilting bee. Everyone, the women from multiple Beit Avs, would have come together to produce flour, to produce bread. And so that also means that's some of how the social networking of the ancient world happens, because work in the fields is much more spread out. Now, in addition to this gendered division of labor, there's also something of an age-based division of labor. We don't see this described in the Bible, but it's what we can determine based on the archaeological remains and the parallels to similar societies, specifically other subsistence agricultural economies. So what we see in these kinds of economies is that children begin working from the age of 3. Children are usually weaned at the age of 3, so they nurse until that time, and that's considered the time when there's a life shift. Now, when I say 3, it doesn't mean on your birthday. Most people in the ancient world wouldn't have known their birthdays, right? When we think about defining childhood, for us it's very much about birthdays. It's very much about age. But in the ancient world, because you don't have to fill out forms on a regular basis, you don't usually need to know your birthday, but you know what biological life stage you're in. There are different life stage shifts that are sometimes ritualized that recognize these different periods of life. And so weaning is one of them. One of the things that we see within Scripture is the celebration of Isaac's weaning. That when, and there's mine. The celebration of Isaac's weaning, right? That it is recognized with the celebration in the book of Genesis. Right? And so weaning is one particular transition. We also recognize that menarche is also a transition, that entering into puberty in a noticeable way is also a life stage. And so we can think of childhood as between weaning and what today we would think of as puberty, whereas we can think of infancy as the time before weaning. One of the ways that we can tell that these life stages were considered significant in the biblical world is that in the archaeological record, burials take place differently depending on your life stage. So pre-weaned infants are often buried in jars. Remember, so I told you that storage would have been in large clay jars. And so an infant was often buried near the home in a large clay jar. And then when we see children, they're also often buried near the home individually. But adults are buried in a family tomb. And this is likely because they were people who were contributing to the family, not necessarily as workers, because children are also contributing as workers, but to the reproductive future of the family. And so there's different burial practices for different age groups. The way a family tomb functioned is that it had multiple shelves in it, where a body would be placed. And when a shelf needed to be made available for another family member, because a previous body would have decomposed, the bones, the remains, would have been gathered to their fathers. When we talk about the euphemism used throughout the Old Testament, And then he was gathered to his fathers. It refers to this practice of joining the other remains at the back of the tomb. And so we can see how these life stages functioned based on this aspect of the archaeological record. So children's work includes tasks that many have often assumed must have been a part of women's work. But it includes tasks that are specifically for children. And for older children, that includes taking care of infants. So childcare is a part of children's work. Animal care is also a big part of children's work. And we see that, for example, with David when he's taking care of sheep. And then gathering wood and water are also important tasks that would be designated to children. So it's less that the children are participating in the women's work and more that they have their own specific tasks. And one of the phrases that we use when we talk about children's work today is chores, right? We talk about some of them do some chores, right? When we talk about chores, it's different from the kind of work that's being done in the ancient world because it's not to build character, it's not to earn allowance, it's not so that they'll know how to do it when they go to college. It's because if nobody does it, we're all going to die. And so when Rachel says, "Give me children or I shall die," she really means it. And it's not just her. The entire family urgently needs children for the workforce. When we say it's a subsistence agricultural economy, and we said last week that that's exactly what it sounds like. It takes the full-time labor of everyone from the age of 3 up for everyone to survive. And so the contrast between our children, who are difficult and privileged and impatient and follow their interests to their overscheduled activities, and the children in the Bible, who are economically valuable, is stark. Now, when we think of our children, it is absolutely a privilege to live in this way. And yet there's also something missing from it. So our children are priceless, right? They have emotional value, right? It goes back to that idea of the wrongful death, right? They are priceless. They have emotional value that we could not put a price on. That, in fact, we have a cultural taboo against putting a price on. But they don't always feel useful or needed. Now, if I ask my children, they don't want to feel useful or needed. They probably feel like they got yanked into that kitchen against their will. But when we think about the activities that they participate in, and as church people, the activities that they participate in instead of going to church, they feel needed at soccer. The team can't continue if they don't have enough players. Do they feel needed here? What do we need children for, or we will die in church? Any thoughts?
We need younger members so that you can continue.
Right. Right, the church as a whole, right? If we're thinking in the biblical sense about communal survival, rather than about individual survival, communally, as the church, on a larger scale, we do need children or we will die. And so there's a great deal for us to learn from this biblical perspective on children. And it's not start child labor at the age of 3. But it's that there is a balance to be kept between the priceless and the valuable. And that we really do need children. We're very accustomed to thinking of children as dependents and people that we entertain and people that we protect. But they have incredible skills to bring to us, just as they do in the ancient world. So I'm not going to give, in the few minutes we have, I'm not going to give you a lecture on the entire history of the formation of the Bible, I promise. But one of the things that I want you to know about the history of the formation of the Bible is that it used to be passed on through oral tradition. It didn't used to be written down. And the people who knew how to write were scribes. They had scribal families. They were some of the only people who weren't living like this. Instead, they were learning to read and write and memorize text. And when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem and took everyone into exile, they didn't actually take everyone into exile. They took anyone who they thought could start a revolution. Anyone with special skills, anyone with leadership, and especially all the scribes. Which means that the people who were in exile, trying to culturally survive, were the educated people who had learned that the way that our culture survives is by memorizing our stories and passing them on to the next generation. And so, shortened version, the reason we continue to have the Bible is because they knew that telling our stories and traditions and continually passing them on was the only way to survive. So, just as the people in the subsistence agricultural economy were surviving economically by way of depending on their children, those scribes knew that to survive culturally, they needed to depend on their children. And so when we look in the book of Exodus, it's almost like the opposite of a catechism. It says, when your child asks you, you will say. And they command us as adults to pass down our stories and our traditions. I wonder what questions you all have. If you don't ask a question, I'll keep telling you more information.
I thought that I grew up in a church that treated the children as capable of doing something. And the thing,
Yeah.
I know that by 7th grade, some of us were being organized, called in to plan our own programs.
Yeah. And you're here.
Pardon?
And you're here.
Yeah, I'm here.
I'm
Yeah,
proud of
right.
you.
They fooled me. They thought I had some worth and should have some authority.
Well, and I think that accomplished something, because you do have some worth,
Yeah.
right? And so one of the ways we can communicate to children that they have worth is by depending on them. And they do have incredible skills. Last week, when we were trying to determine what to do with the technology, I was asked, okay, what can we do next week that'll be different? And clearly we got that. And I said, well, I have a 13-year-old son. Right? Because often the solution to technology is find a teenager, or Pete. And so we recognize that there are some skills that kids really have. Some of them are really eco-savvy, or really computer-savvy, or really small so that they can fit between your knees and the pew to pass a plate. Or they're involved in so many activities that they play a musical instrument. Or they could dramatically present scripture really well. Right? And so when we think about ways we can tell children that they're important, not in a priceless way, although they absolutely are important in a priceless way, but also in a valuable way. We're not tricking children, right? I know you're being facetious, into thinking that knowing they're valuable. We want them to know that they're not just priceless, but they're also valuable.
Well,
Yes.
So I think it's that those are, the interesting observations and somewhat like what are the implications
Yeah.
for us. And I think Dale gave this example that the youth or the children were planning the program at church, so they felt engaged with the church. I see these like the technology skills. Yes, you want to feel engaged at church. And the church we were in when our kids were teens, we had a son who ran the soundboard or something.
Mhm.
When they closed the church, they never thanked him. He's not in the church, it was invisible, but his skills earn him a living.
Yeah.
So it's useful, but I think part of, if we think of the church surviving or our own families surviving, it's a narrow aspect of being useful to engage our institutions to continue, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, boy, that's a real interesting implications.
It is.
And I think, being in my 70s, and I was born with my parents in the 40s, some of the stories are way back there, right? And I don't think my grandchildren or my nieces and nephews grasp much out of that. And the things you're saying here are saying, boy, start thinking about this so that make a difference.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good thing to be thinking about, absolutely.
You're actually reminding me, and this probably might be multi-generational, that a lot of what I remember from my childhood is when I did feel useful.
Mm.
I was going to say, and this is, I understand these are generalizations.
Yeah.
But one of the things, as a mother of 3 married sons, what has been an interesting observation for me and my late husband before me is the way that our kids were raised was different in many ways than the way our daughters-in-law were raised. And sometimes it surrounds that very kind of thing. What are the expectations? And one of my daughters-in-law and her family, every one of the children were expected to pay for one of the 4 years of college.
Okay.
And the parents would pay for the other 3. And it took you longer than that, then you paid for the extra. Well, in our family, we said, education's really important. Your job is to work hard, get good grades, take this seriously, and you're on your own when you're a grown-up financially. But it's really interesting, I think, that these same issues are being worked out today in a smaller way, within our families.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So part of this is just recognizing that there are so many ways of constructing childhood, of constructing family, and what that means to each of us. And so when we go into Scripture, some of the things that are most difficult for us to understand are because they're coming from such a different perspective than we are, specifically about children and family. I talked about the idea that children are economically valuable and in ways that make sense within a subsistence agricultural economy. And the idea that we have a taboo against placing an economic value on a child. Right? I'm not willing to sell either of my children. But when we go into Scripture, people are. And are sometimes forced to. And so when we look at the value of a human life in Scripture, one of the things to remember is that things that are priceless for us, like children, like family, like marriage, are economically valuable primarily in the world of the Bible. And so they have a different set of taboos than we do. That's why you see children and adults sold in the Bible. It's also why human sexuality is also considered to be economically valuable in the ancient world. And that's a difficult thing for us to accept. Because for us, human sexuality is priceless, has emotional value. And we also have a taboo, like our taboo on placing an economic value on a child, and placing an economic value on human sexuality. But as the process that leads to the economically valuable child, it has a primarily economic value in the world that produced the Bible. One of the ways that we see this is in the book of Proverbs. In Proverbs 6:26, it says, "A prostitute's fee is only a loaf of bread, but the wife of another stalks a man's very life." This is stated as a warning to a student, right? And so it functions under the assumption that human sexuality has an economic value, and that's not a problem. The problem is disrupting the family structures that help the subsistence agricultural economy survive, right? The disruption to that family structure without which we can't make it. And so when we think about this, it helps us remember why marriage in particular is considered to be economically valuable. And so a lot of the regulations around human sexuality in the Bible are also put in perspective by recognizing that children are primarily economic in value in the biblical world. Which means, right, children are, marriage is, family is. And this brings us back to the conversation that we started last week. What do we do with the Bible once we know this? And so we looked at how we've learned these family structures. We looked at levirate marriage, for example, where when a man dies, his brother needs to marry his widow so that they can have a child who will legally be the child of the dead brother, although biologically the child of the alive brother. We had a diagram last week because that's complicated, right? But structures like that aren't what we want for our world. They don't fit with our economy, and they don't fit with our values. They fit with this economy, right? The idea that a prostitute's fee is only a loaf of bread, but the wife of another man stalks her very life, works in this economy. The idea that you can sell your child works in this economy. And so we have a choice. We can say, well, I like this part of the Bible, but not that part of the Bible. And that's a little complicated, and you can discern that for yourself, right? Or you can say, how do I get a blessing out of this text? Okay. I talk to my students about wrestling a blessing out of this text, thinking about Jacob wrestling with the angel, right? And so when we think about a text this difficult, often what I do, especially with biblical law codes, is look at what that law code is trying to accomplish in its economic world. In a world where childhood, family, and marriage are valuable. And how could I accomplish what they're trying to accomplish, not in the structure, but in the value behind it, right? Because usually what the value is is making sure that everyone survives, including those daughters who are temporary, right? Making sure that they get to be a part of a family in a permanent way. Because if you are turned loose from the family, it's like losing your job. It's not just that a woman can't survive without this structure. A man can't survive with this structure. Those raw products of agriculture are not getting you anywhere. Also, you can't produce anything without products of agriculture that you don't have. And nobody's going to make it without wood, water, animals, and childcare. Right? Everybody needs everybody else. And so although biblical law codes prescribe structures that don't work for us in our value system or in our economy, the idea of interdependent survival is behind every one of them. It's just really hard to tell when we think that children are priceless, when we think that human sexuality is priceless. We get offended by those law codes, absolutely, because they're working from a really different economy and a really different world. We have a few minutes left for questions. I would love to hear from all of you.
I feel I need to say that a lot of our assumptions that we've made this morning do not apply when people are struggling economically.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, for example, if you look at the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, it assumes this understanding, maybe not the overscheduled bit, right? It assumes a priceless understanding of childhood and places that upon some folks who are struggling economically, where what is in the best interest of the child is survival, right? And so a lot of these ancient structures are, we see them again.
Right.
In cultures where folks are struggling economically. Absolutely. Thanks, Pete.
Go ahead, John. You go. Already talked.
The whole concept of childhood, does it even apply in this world of ancient Near East? I mean, we perceive of it as a kind of sphere or stage that you transition through. But it might be inaccurate to deal with what you're talking about. It's the same thing with adolescence, and then it's that whole business seems foreign to this world.
So Philip Aries made that exact same argument, right? That people didn't recognize childhood, that there was no childhood, that children were just little adults. So he made that argument for the medieval period, but certainly I think would have applied it to the ancient world as well, saying because children, and for him, the argument was because children aren't being protected, they're not being set apart as a separate group of people. But what's come through in modern childhood studies is the idea that it is childhood, it's just an incredibly different childhood. That the construction of childhood that we have is about protection and innocence and being cute and about pricelessness. And so other cultural contexts do see children as a separate group, but don't physically separate them in the same way that we do into schools and youth rooms and Sunday school, right? Everyone is together, even though they're considered different because they're young and small and growing and learning, right? But there isn't the same idea that they need to be protected, and there isn't the same idea that they need to be separated from all things economic and protected from economic concerns or violence or even human sexuality. Everyone is around everyone all of the time. It's a really small community. So children are considered different from adults, but what that means is they are learning the adult labor while performing child labor, right? So it's still childhood. It's an incredibly different childhood. It's something that scholars have been discussing for a long time. Is this really childhood if it's mostly about suffering? And it is very much about suffering. Often when I tell people I study children in the Bible, they say, oh, no, they work, they die. It's not cute. But where we've come to in childhood studies at the moment is there is an idea of childhood in each cultural context, but they're very different from our own. So there is a childhood, but childhood is about working. Yeah.
So can you salvage Christ's statement? This is indirectly related. Christ said you have to be like a child.
I love that one.
But so,
Yeah.
but it may not be translated properly, I don't know.
No, it is translated properly and much discussed among child-centered biblical criticism. And so the understanding is that it does not mean to be innocent, because that comes from our cultural context, but that to be like a child is to be vulnerable and of low status. Children would be considered to be very low status in the ancient world. That was a part of their construction of childhood. And there was a recognition that they are vulnerable, that they don't have legal standing, that they are physically smaller and weaker. So there's a vulnerability and lack of social standing that most of us have concluded is what that text is about.
That's interesting.
So sometimes it get used to kind of just say, children are important. At least in our churches.
Yeah.
Don't worry about the children in worship, because
Right.
Christ gave them an elevated state we should all be like.
Well, or rather, Christ recognized that we should all be in their lowly state, right? And so, I also am a proponent for children in worship for some of the reasons that we were discussing today, that we don't learn how to do it unless we're there. And if we send children someplace else, then they learn that church is where you get sent away, why would I come back? Or that church is for the purpose of education, and education is something you graduate from. There's a fantastic but terrible, but appropriate, church joke. So there was a congregation that had bats in their sanctuary, and they could not get rid of the bats. Every committee tried. They called pest control, they called animal protection, nobody could do it. So they went to their pastor. They said, Pastor, we don't know what to do. We don't know how to get rid of the bats. And she said, that's easy. You just confirm them. They'll never come back. Yes, if you ever get bats in your sanctuary.
Well, I think it's about time for us to go to our next phase. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope everyone can return next week. I've forgotten our program.
Hold on, John, you got to talk in the microphone because it will not show up.
All right. So thank you again, Laurel, for a wonderful, informative program. And I hope that everyone returns next week.
Yeah, Next week, we're going to have our church treasurer and the chair of the finance team. They're going to be talking about church finances and how we organize them, and they will take questions.
Thanks for coming, and thanks again to Laurel. Bye.